Okay, my name is Steve Sparks, the current president of VGP until 31st of December for this year, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Daly lecture. It's one of the perks of being president of VGP that the president has the opportunity to choose the Daly lecturer each year. And it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Tian and Ague as this year's Daly lecturer. I spent a very enjoyable sabbatical at Yale in 2007 next to Jay's office, and had a lot of very interesting discussions and learned a lot. And in fact, we ended up in Scotland together. And one of my quirks is I collect rocks for my garden. And I've got a beautiful staurolite chlorite schist sitting in my garden as part of my rock collection, which I collected with Jay on the Buchan zone. So that was very enjoyable. So just to introduce Jay, he's the Henry Barnard Davis Professor of Geology and Geophysics at Yale University in the Department of Geology and Geophysics. And he's also curator in charge of mineralogy at Yale Peabody Museum. He's currently the chair of the Yale department. He's got his undergraduate degree at Wayne State University in Detroit and PhD from UC Berkeley, and then joined the Yale faculty. And of course, he's extremely well known for his very broad interests in orogenic belts, geohydrology, metamorphic petrology, geochemistry, more recently carbon capture and sequestration, and a whole host of great contributions to this area of geochemistry. He's also, of course, well known as one of the sort of stalwarts of the sort of editorial world, as involved as chief editor of American Journal of Science, and also involved in Journal of Metamorphic Petrology. Made a huge number of really wonderful contributions. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite Jay to the platform. But before doing so, I would say that, as I say, this is my last occasion as VGP president, and so far every award ceremony has gone completely smoothly, without any fault, and people who know me think that might be a very low probability event. And this time, of course, the very last occasion, I left Jay's wonderful certificate to acknowledge his delivering the Daly lecture in my hotel room. But so apologies for that. So I'm going to shake Jay's hand for his achievements and for delivering the Daly lecture with an imaginary certificate.
Thank you.
And I'll be delivering the real certificate to Jay sometime later in the meeting. So, Jay.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Steve, and congratulations on your term as president. I'd like to thank Steve and the VGP division for the opportunity to present the Daly lecture this year. It's really a very, very great honor, and I'm truly grateful for it. If you look over the past recipients and lecturers, it's really a very humbling experience to be in such company. Very big shoes to fill, and I'll try my best this morning. So I've been very fortunate at Yale to have had Bob Berner as a colleague over the past couple of decades. And a number of years ago, he told me that the most poorly constrained part of the long-term geological carbon cycle is the flux from metamorphism and deep diagenesis. And one of the reasons we really care about these fluxes, of course, is information like this, the CO2 in the atmosphere over geologic time. And a question you could ask is, does metamorphic outgassing, have anything to do with the shape of this curve, either in terms of producing transients or long-term modulations and so on? So today I'll try and examine some of the factors involved in metamorphic CO2 outgassing in collisional orogens. I won't have any direct answers, but try to sort of reboot this problem and put it back on our collective radar screens. And we should care a lot about carbonate rocks because there's a lot of them, as you can see here, and in fact whole mountain ranges made out of them. And if you added up all the CO2 in these rocks and compared it to the atmosphere, there'd be something like 1 million times more CO2 in the rock reservoir. So if that was to be unleashed via orogenic activity, it could be a very potent source of carbon indeed. And, you know, there are a wide array of metamorphic environments. Today I'm going to be focusing, there we go, on collisional environments, but there's also rifting and, of course, subduction and other permutations too. Probably the one that's been studied in the most detail is subduction, both in terms of the quantity of subducted carbonate material as well as the CO2 release through arc volcanism. Some inventories suggest that there's a great imbalance between a large amount of CO2 going down and a relatively small amount coming out. Perhaps there's another source. Perhaps that's orogenic outgassing. But we won't be answering that question today, but we'll look at it. And if you look at the world's mountain belts, of course, the type example of a collisional region is the Himalaya. And a number of workers have asked how much CO2 outgassing is there. And the 90s were a particularly fertile decade for asking this question and addressing it. And there are several papers that are quite foundational, at least very influential for me, that I'd like to highlight here. One of them was Kerrick and Caldeira in '93, and in this paper they showed that metamorphic outgassing could potentially be a driver of global temperature change if the CO2 fluxes were large enough, of the order of 10 to the 18th moles per million years or larger. Coming from a different perspective, Selverstone and Gutzler looked at the burial of carbonate rock during alpine orogenesis, more from a carbon sequestration standpoint, and suggested that this burial could have actually led to global cooling and the long-term cooling trend over the last 125 million years or so. Mike Bickle in '96 and continuing in his group more recently has emphasized how orogeny provides both a carbon source in terms of metamorphic outgassing and sink, the enhanced weathering due to rapid exhumation and erosion. And the interplay between the source and sink is extremely important to understand in terms of whether there's net carbon output or burial. And then finally, another very influential paper, again, Kerrick and Caldeira, looked in detail at Eocene warming in the Himalaya and concluded that Himalayan outgassing was probably not sufficient to have caused Eocene warming, but shallow Pluton-driven metamorphism in the western North American Cordillera may have been. Now, this is a whole other type of metamorphic outgassing that I'm not going to be examining today. But if you look at these papers, you can see there's been quite a bit of foundational work and understanding of the basic problems involved. And to be frank, we're not going to go much beyond what was known here, but I would like to try and put it into perspective from what we've learned over the last 10, 15 years worth of metamorphic petrology. The first, most basic question you could ask is how much fluid are we talking about? And an easy back-of-the-envelope calculation you can do is take a crustal column, say a big, thick metamorphic pile, 25 kilometers long in this example, and say that on average it loses 2.5 weight% water and CO2 by dehydration and decarbonation. So if you integrate that fluid up through this column and say maybe right up to the brittle ductile transition, you can calculate how much fluid is coming out the top of this column. And the time-integrated fluid flux is around 1,500 cubic meters of fluid per square meter of rock. That's a column of fluid 1.5 kilometers long, passing over each square meter. That's a huge amount of fluid. And in fact, if you were to take that and integrate it over a Himalayan scale orogen, this is more than 10 times the total amount of water in the world's lakes and rivers. So clearly we have a lot of fluid that we can play with here. And for a somewhat more detailed look at this, we've done coupled numerical models of fluid flow and heat transfer in a model two-dimensional overthrust terrain, basically a two-dimensional version of a classical England and Thomson type model, where you have an overthrust plate and a lower plate that undergoes conductive thermal relaxation, and we erode at, in this case, 1 millimeter a year. You can see that most of the fluid flow arrows are upward. I'll talk more about these patterns a little further on in the talk. And in the lower part here, we zoom in on this overthrust area, and we've contoured the time-integrated fluid fluxes. And as you go down through the crustal section and across the mountain belt, you can see that much of the area is characterized by fluxes in excess of 1,000 cubic meters per meter squared. The color zones here are index mineral, Barovian index mineral zones going from high grade to low grade. The point is, again, we conclude that there's a lot of fluid here to deal with. And speaking of foundational papers, the next sort of issue we need to deal with is how much CO2 is in that fluid. And one of the great legacies of Daly, for whom this lecture series is named, is his great tradition as an educator. And he taught at MIT and Harvard, and at the same time influenced many students, foremost among them being the great Norman Bowen. And in 1940, he wrote one of the truly seminal papers in petrology looking at the decarbonation of silicious limestone, complete with phase chemography, a list of the expected index minerals with increasing grade, and you know, this is foundational for what we do even right up to this day. And it's fun to read these old papers because they have maybe a little bit different style than we're used to today. I like this quote here. This material was first brought together with the purpose of presenting to students as a logical whole a subject that otherwise is bare, arid description. So I'll try to go a little bit beyond that today. They don't write them like they used to. I wouldn't suggest putting that in your grant proposals, but it's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work. And so today, using Bowen as a foundation and moving forward, we can map those very same index mineral zones across the world. And a couple of places that have received a lot of attention over the last couple of decades are in the New England Appalachians. And I'll refer to these for examples of CO2 release in many of the following slides. The first one here is the Wepawag schist in Connecticut. It's a metapilitic sequence that has about 10 volume% metacarbonate layers in it. These rocks have been studied by many, many people at Yale, including myself, my colleague Danny Rye, and going all the way back to actually Dana and Silliman. On the left here, we have the metapilitic index mineral zones going from chlorite to increasing grade up to starlite and kyanite in the west. And you can map index mineral zones in the metacarbonate rocks too: anchorite, albite, oligoclase, biotite, amphibole, diopside, with increasing metamorphic grade. And farther north in Vermont, we have the Waits River Formation, which has been intensively studied by John Ferry and his research group, including people like Lucas Baumgartner and Albert Leger, Sarah Penniston-Dorland, Boswing, Greg Dipple, and others. And very careful mapping of isograds here, I'm sorry it's not in color, but basically reveals the very same index mineral zones as we see in the Wepawag. In fact, they may actually be the same rock unit, just separated by a couple of states or so. So what does the progressive metamorphism look like? You can see this most easily in thin section, actually. At the lowest grade, we have fine-grained rocks characterized by a lot of anchorite, calcite, albite, very fine-grained muscovite, quartz, accessory minerals. With increasing metamorphism and fluid rock interaction, muscovite and anchorite combine, and you begin to make biotite. And with increasing grades still, we get reactions that produce calcic amphiboles. And finally, at the highest grades, the rocks are very rich in diopside, zoisite, and other calc-silicate minerals. One thing that you can see is very obvious here in the high-grade example versus the low-grade is just how much more carbonate material there is at low grade relative to high. And what this tells us right off the bat is that there's been a lot of carbon dioxide loss with progressive metamorphism. And there are a variety of ways to lose CO2 from rocks during prograde heating. And I'll just review these here. Various sort of classical models of external or internal buffering, cross-layer infiltration, and fluid flow in a temperature gradient. I'd like to take each one of these briefly in turn. This shows a temperature XCO2 pseudo-section, very simple, impure, sort of marley composition where you have dolomite as an index mineral, tremolite, diopside, and wollastonite as increasing grade. The external buffering case and internal buffering case, sort of classical end members, as described in another really fundamental paper by Greenwood, are shown here. External buffering, you could think of completely externally dominated fluids coming from, say, maybe a degassing intrusion or whatever. The rock can't control its fluid composition, so it's externally buffered. And in the internally buffered case, it's the exact opposite. There's no fluid infiltration. And so as the rock heats up, the reactions take place. Here, dolomite breaks down with other minerals to form tremolite, and the CO2 content of the pore fluid gets more and more CO2 rich until you reach an isobaric invariant point or maybe a consolute point. Okay? One thing to bear in mind on a diagram like this is that just if you're even at a constant temperature, say at 550 degrees in the dolomite stable field here, if you have infiltration of a water-rich fluid, you will move in this direction on the diagram into the stability field of a more reacted and decarbonated mineral assemblages. Now, the truth probably lies somewhere in between here. One thing I can say is that there's been a move in some circles petrologically in recent years to consider sort of every rock as being internally buffered. But we can rule that out very easily for these rocks because internal buffering predicts very high CO2 values at maximum reaction progress. And if you actually look at field-based estimates of the mole fraction of CO2 as a function of grade, the dark circles here, you can see that those estimates are all less than about 15% CO2 in the fluid. And the only way you can really reproduce these kinds of numbers is if you have infiltration and reaction occurring simultaneously. All right? And that's what these colored symbols show. They match the field data quite well. So that brings us to infiltration and infiltration across metamorphic carbonate layers. So in the Wepawag, this is very well shown, where you have 1 to 10 meter thick metacarbonate layers intercalated with metapilitic rocks. And if you zoom in and map these layers, you very often find that they are mineralogically zoned. Here's an example from the amphibolite facies. The interior of the metacarbonate layer is still fairly unreacted. It contains biotite. But then as you go to the margins of the layer, it gets more reacted, more devolatilized, amphibole is present, and then finally on the margins you have these highly devolatilized calc silicates. So there's basically a zoning in reaction progress across these layers. So that's the key field observation here. And you can model various flow reaction scenarios, which we've done here in terms of coupled fluid flow and chemical reaction. shown the layers of metacarbonate as sort of vertical. You could imagine isoclinally folded strata. The actual orientation of the layers doesn't mean a whole lot here. What's going on is the whole system is heating up. Fluid is moving down temperature. And what's contoured here are XCO2 values. They're higher in general at higher temperatures and lower at lower temperatures, which accounts for the overall color trend. But in detail, what's happening is that the metapelites are dehydrating, are producing water, and the metacarbonate rock is going to be producing CO2. So the input of water will tend to drive CO2 release from the metacarbonate, and the input of CO2 will tend to drive dehydration of the metapelite. So it's a coupled devolatilization process. And if you look at the actual shape of the fluid composition contours, you can see that they have a very strong diffusion dispersion type shape. And what is happening here is that there's a lot of predicted diffusion through the pore fluid as well as mechanical dispersion of fluid species between coexisting layers. All right? And the final point to notice is that the gradients in fluid composition are biggest on the margins of the metacarbonate layers. And this was recognized qualitatively by Hewitt in 1973. That means we would expect the reaction progress to be greatest on the layers at margins and then move inward. So the kind of picture that evolves is where you have a lot of layer parallel fluid flow. This is both in Connecticut and Vermont. There is some flow internally to the metacarbonate, some cross-layer flow. There's also a lot of diffusion and mechanical dispersion, flow along cracks too. It's very complicated. But as the water infiltrates into these layers, you get progressive mineral zones developing, most intense on the layer margins, until ultimately the whole rock is reacted and it continues to heat up until you hit the next suite of reactions. And John Ferry and co-workers have shown at this meeting, actually, that transport and infiltration between different carbonate layers can, in fact, drive very, very similar processes. Finally, just to review up-temperature fluid flow, and this was brought to the community's attention in this classic paper by Baumgartner and Ferry. Again, a T-XCO2 diagram, kind of a Lagrangian viewpoint, if you will, for the fluid. Just say a fluid parcel, as it heats up and it's reacting with these minerals, it will get more CO2 rich as the temperature goes up. Hence, something flowing towards something hotter will get more CO2 rich and strip CO2 from the rock. And there are a number of environments where you might get such up-temperature fluid flow, say, for example, upward through inverted geotherms beneath regional thrusts. And another example that I think could use some additional field testing is flow upward through inverted geotherms beneath intrusions. And I'll just show an example of that, again, from the modeling perspective. This is that same sort of overthrust terrain that I described earlier in 2 dimensions, but now sort of inspired by the hot zone concept of Annan and Sparks, we've introduced magmatic sills injected over a sort of what we hope is a realistic time frame. The idea, as shown very well in Daly's classic textbook, is a sill intrusion, multiple sills feeding each other like this. And you can see them here in black. These are mafic sills in the model, but we've also done intermediate sills, and you get the same result. And basically, it's hot where these bodies are intruded. And in the orange-yellow gradient here, all these boxes are zones where the fluid is still moving upward, but it's getting hotter. So this is a region of up-temperature fluid flow. And, as you go farther north in New England, there are many large intrusions that sort of cap the sequence, and it may be that fluids were flowing upward toward them. And this up-T flow environment, of course, is good for all the other mechanisms of decarbonation, too, and could be a very fertile source of CO2 release. All right, so those are some theoretical considerations, but there's also field constraints. And basically what this diagram shows is a mass balance analysis of rocks from the Weppawag and the Waits River Formation. where we have taken the high-grade rock, like here in the diopside zone, and compared it to a low-grade precursor and done a calculation of how much volatile loss there has been. And this is equivalent to weight percent. So these are the mean values surrounded by one sigma standard errors. And you can see for these 96 samples of Wepoag, there's a very clear decrease in the amount of CO2 in the rock. But almost all of this volatile loss is CO2, by the way. And the same is true for the Waits River formation, actually even more pronounced decrease. So it's easy to see that we could, for sequences like this, release at least 10 weight percent CO2 from these kinds of sequences. Just if you want some theoretical backing for that, we can look at pseudosection. This is one just done by in Theriac Domino. And it's a temperature activity of CO2 pseudosection drawn for representative pressure. And you can see our major mineral index zones here: anchorite, biotite, amphibole, diopside. And so you could come at this from a completely different perspective and use thermobarometry to determine pressure and temperature, and mineral compositions to determine XCO2 in the coexisting fluids, and say you got a result like that. You could plot it on this diagram and say, okay, that's my stability field for my diopside-bearing mineral assemblage. How much CO2 does that rock contain? So you can calculate it. And for representative composition, the yellow is the calculations, and the other is the observed. So I think you can see that the agreement is striking, and there's no doubt that these rocks are losing a lot of CO2. It would have been easier to just make one pseudosection than analyze 96 rocks, but hey, at least we're confident of the result. But we're not done yet. There's another thing I'd like to discuss, and that's the margins of these rocks, these layers. And they are very highly reacted calc-silicates. And they occur both at the margins and also in selvages around cross-cutting veins. And they are really hammered. They are veined, large crystals of zoisite, hornblende, garnet in some cases, carbonate minerals completely blown out of the rock. And if you do a mass balance for those, they are way down here, almost 25 weight percent CO2 loss on average. All right? So I guess what I'm emphasizing here is that there is no shortage of CO2 to be generated from impure carbonate rocks in metasedimentary dominated orogenic belts. But then, okay, what do you do with that CO2? How do you turn that into a flux estimate for orogeny? And there have been classic papers that examine exactly this question, and we'll go through it here. One thing you need to know is the areal extent of your mountain belt, how much rock is decarbonating. You need to know the time-integrated flux of CO2 that's coming out of your rock sequence, and you need to know something about the time scale of fluid release. Let's look at the areal extents of mountain belts first. This just comes from the Google geographic database, and area in millions of square kilometers and a variety of modern mountain belts. The Himalaya, depending upon how you count it, is somewhere around 1 million square kilometers, and I'll use that areal estimate in the calculations that follow. Also need to know something about how much CO2 might be released from your rock. That means you need to know how much metacarbonate rock there is. The Wepoag has 10%. The Waits River can be 50, 80%, so much, much richer. We'll take 10% of CO2 loss as representative. And if you have a 25 kilometer long column, that leads to a time-integrated flux of CO2 of about 700,000 kilograms per meter squared, which is huge. And then finally, we can argue about this number. It's complicated to say what is the minimum flux you would need to actually affect global climate. But this is a good baseline number, and I'm going to use it here for the following graph, just so we can get a sense of where we're at. So what this shows then for the devolatilization is a volume fraction of metacarbonate in your metasedimentary sequence as a function of the fluid release duration. And the 10 to the 18th number is right here in the white contour. And anything above here exceeds the Kerrick and Caldeira threshold. So, for example, if you had 10% carbonate rock in your sedimentary sequence, it would have to devolatilize on a time scale of about 17 million years or less to produce the appropriate CO2 flux rate. And these are quite conservative numbers, small amounts of metacarbonate, certainly plausible time scales for orogenic fluid release. And to give you some perspective on how that flux rate compares to others, this is now in terms of log gigatons per year CO2. Some examples from the literature. Mount Pinatubo, the estimated long-term average down here. Here's our metamorphic minimum. Here's global volcanism estimates. These are about 5-6 times bigger than this minimum here. And then, of course, anthropogenic. Again, this is a log scale of the order of, what is it these days, 35 gigatons per year, something like that. Just to look at that in terms of metamorphism, you know, it would take about a half day's worth of anthropogenic emissions to equal an entire year of metamorphic outgassing at this rate. So it kind of puts it in perspective for you. Okay, so I think we've established that this kind of a flux rate is plausible. However, it's a long way between establishing this flux rate and actually saying that we can make intelligent statements about what it would do to the CO2 in the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. And we have some big gaps in knowledge that stand in our way. One of them is carbonaceous organic matter, graphite. Is this oxidizing? Is this a source of CO2? Another perennial question are the widespread carbonate fluids in granulite and ultra-high temperature environments. What are these? Are they a source of CO2, a sink? And then finally, retrograde metamorphism. Remember, all of this CO2 that's generated has to get out of the rock. And the question is, can it do so? Well, I'll make some comments on each one of these. And as you know, there are many other things that I could say are major gaps in knowledge. I only have time to talk about three, so these will be the ones. Carbonaceous organic matter is widespread in these organic-rich sequences, both the Wepawag. Well, Wepawag I can speak to in detail as sort of deep water turbidites, very reducing environments, a lot of organic matter preserved. In the chlorite zone, you can see it as this fine, dusty gray or black material that pervades the whole rock. And as you go up to high-grade conditions, it's still there. It's in the porphyroblasts, it's in kyanite, it's in garnet, it's in the matrix. And you might ask yourself, well, do we lose or gain CO2 as we go up through this transition in grade? And these are some unpublished results from graduate student Shuang Zhang and myself, showing the change in the organic carbon as a function of metamorphic grade. And again, mean values with one sigma standard errors, 64 samples. Maybe with Shuang's work here, we're losing about 1/10 of a weight percent of this carbon, which compared to the CO2 flux from the metacarbonate rocks is very, very, very small. All right? That doesn't say carbon transport in a reduced state doesn't happen. If you go elsewhere in New England, like up to the very famous Bristol hotspot in New Hampshire, studied by Paige Chamberlain and Doug Rumble and their co-workers, you can find beautiful graphite ore deposits. Here's a sillimanite, chromium muscovite, graphite schist in a vein. As discussed by Rumble and Herring and other co-workers, you need some process of fluid mixing, say a reduced and oxidized fluid, or some process involving a lot of fluid transport to produce these kinds of deposits. And the question is, how much fluid? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? How much of it gets to the surface? I think these are still very big questions that we need to address. Carbonate fluids in granulite ultra-high temperature environments. We've heard a lot of talk about these at the meeting so far, and they continue to fascinate. One of the really foundational papers in this whole field was Newton et al. In 1980. We talked about the infiltration of CO2-rich vapor driving dehydration and stabilizing continents. Really a provocative paper. Then continued work, for example, John Daly and his colleagues showed how the flow would, if fluids are present, they have to be very channelized. There are very steep gradients in fluid composition, and a very complicated picture of fluid driven reaction emerged. And this is still a topic today. A new issue of Geoscience Frontiers has come out with a special theme on this problem as well. And it's really a big mystery, an unsolved mystery. And I'm not going to solve it here, but I'll just make some comments. Some of you have seen these spectacular examples of charnockite in southern India, where the dark zones are dehydrated zones, and the dehydration is thought to have been produced by infiltration of a CO2-rich fluid and/or a very saline brine, perhaps both, in an immiscible state. Just really amazing picture of what the fluid rock reaction had to have looked like. I'm not going to talk about this area or other classic ones. I'm going to just introduce a new ultra-high temperature metamorphic area that we've discovered in the northeastern part of Connecticut, in the Brimfield schist. These are very high-grade rocks, and it's interesting to compare them to what's known about granulites and UHT rocks elsewhere in the world. They are, as I said, very high-grade. They contain garnet, sillimite, cordierite, quartz, spinel, K-feldspar, large amounts of garnet, and you can see here and here. And the garnets are truly extraordinary if you look at them in thin section, because they are loaded with these crystallographically oriented needles and plates of rutile and ilmenite. Okay, it's known from experimental work that high titanium garnets really only form at very high temperatures and/or very high pressures, and the implication here is that these are precipitates that formed from the cooling garnet as the rocks were being exhumed. Okay, so if you do zirconium in rutile thermometry on these, we've used the Tompkins calibration, you get something like 1.5 weight% in some cases, ZrO2 in these rutiles, and that gives us temperatures of the order of 1,000 degrees centigrade. So this is a new ultra-high temperature terrain. But the other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that there's a lot of other inclusions in these garnets. And what are they? And perhaps as no surprise, my PhD student, Jen Axler, has been doing Raman on these, and you have pure CO2 inclusions, just as has been recognized around the world in other granulite facies terrains. And she's also discovered a bunch of other minerals, and most of which I don't even know. I wrote it down on a napkin yesterday. Arzakite. Arzakite. Anyone know what arzakite is? All right. It is a mercury, sulfur, chlorine, bromine salt. All right? It's a mercury salt. So again, what we're seeing in this terrain is sort of the briny, salty type remnants of a fluid and a pure CO2 fluid. And of course, the Raman can tell you all you need to know about such things. But it gets even stranger, actually. There are more inclusions in these rocks, in these garnets. And this is some field emission gun electron microprobe maps 1 micron scale bar, and these are inclusions that have been breached by polishing, and they contain a wide variety of interesting minerals, including, like up above here, we have coexisting calcium carbonate and magnesite. All of you remember your phase petrology know that calcium carbonate and magnesite are not stable at any sort of crustal P&T conditions, although that can change if you have aragonite in the mantle. You can also find magnesite in 2 different flavors. Here we have a magnesium-rich magnesite and an iron-rich magnesite in the same inclusion, together with high field strength element minerals like zircon and tiny 100, maybe 200 nanometer rutiles. So these are extraordinarily complicated fluids that contain carbonate species. Things like this have been found in ultra-high pressure terrains. I don't know if that's relevant here, but the bottom line is that these metapelitic rocks have magnesite and other very interesting inclusions in them, and we don't know how they got there. Does this reflect metamorphic devolatilization at super high temperature conditions? Are these fluids released from igneous intrusions? Is there a mantle source? Is this CO2 streaming up off the subducted slab? We really have no idea, and I think that the whole contribution of these ultra high temperature and granulite fluids to the carbon cycle is a major issue going forward. Finally, retrograde metamorphism. This one is largely going to be a sink for CO2. Question is, we're generating all this fluid at depth. How much of it is making it up past the brittle ductile transition? How much of it is getting up towards the surface? And there are 2 sort of impediments to this flow. One of them is chemical. It's the uptake of CO2 from ascending fluids due to retrograde reactions. The other is physical, involving the possible clogging of porosity and the limits on retrograde fluid flow. So we'll take each of these in turn. Come back to this diagram. In rocks in which there's not a lot of solid solution in the minerals, these up and down temperature flow reactions work very well. And now let's turn the problem around and talk about down temperature flow. Again, a rock that contains this reactive assemblage. A fluid moving towards the surface and cooling off is going to get more poor in CO2 as temperature decreases. And the way it does that is it deposits CO2 in the rock. And you can see this reaction over and over again in the field. Here's a beautiful example that shows a once proud tremolite, all, right here, totally invaded by dolomite and quartz and a few other reaction products. So this mineral is sequestering CO2. So to look at this flow process, we've sort of examined 2 flow end members. A graduate student, Meng Tian, who had a poster on this earlier in the week. One in which we have a simple model of upward flow in a simple 1-phase Darcian regime. The other is a 2-phase porosity wave flow regime. But in both, what's happening here is that we have an upward migrating fluid that hits a reactive layer that contains that tremolite dolomite assemblage that I just mentioned. Then it goes through an unreactive layer and then back through a reactive layer and then out the top. All right? The good news from the standpoint of just simplifying chemistry is that whether it's a 1-phase or a 2-phase flow, Meng's calculations show that the reaction progress is basically the same for either case. So that simplifies our lives quite a bit. And to make a long story short, without getting into all the equations, here's what you see. Over on the right is a depth, and we've chosen the depth so we're sort of going from mid-deep crust up to the brittle ductile transition. What's on the x-axis here is reaction progress, which you can take as proportional to CO2 uptake. So when the fluid that carries some carbonate, is dissolved CO2, hits the reactive layer, you get a big jump in reaction progress, CO2 is sequestered. Enter the unreactive layer, nothing happens. Hit the reactive layer, and then we're way out of equilibrium here because the temperature and fluid compositions are very poorly matched, but nonetheless, we have to do what we have to do, and so the fluid goes in and it really reacts and takes out CO2. Bottom line here is that CO2 is being quantitatively removed from the fluid if it hits a reactive rock layer. So we have to worry about regional geology when we're talking about the escape of CO2-rich fluids. High-grade metamorphic rocks that overlie a devolatilizing sequence, or ultramafic rocks that overlie such a sequence, are going to be particularly good absorbers of CO2 and prevent the escape of that gas. Another issue is just calcium carbonate solubility. In these experiments by Castiagli and Manning, you can see here that the concentration of calcium carbonate in solution in water is very high at high pressures and elevated temperatures. But as you go to lower pressure conditions, there will be calcite precipitation as pressure drops for ascending fluids. This seems pretty inescapable. And, there are calcite veins everywhere, retrograde veins everywhere, as I'm sure many of you know. This is an example of a cross-cutting vein from a marble in the western part of Connecticut. You cut it open, and it's quite interesting to look at because it's actually brecciated, and it's filled in with all new calcite precipitation. But basically, the only mineral in this rock is calcite. So this is calcite that's been precipitated by a retrograde fluid, cross-cuts all the prograde structures. You'll also notice that it's gray. See the gray? Gray is because there's fluid inclusions present and there's finely disseminated graphite in here too. So here's another part of the carbon story, and I have no idea why it's here or what the flux was, but it's here nonetheless. Physical issues, clogging of porosity and limits on flow. Almost all of these retrograde reactions have positive volume changes. And so the classical interpretation is if you have fluid moving along grain boundaries, you precipitate retrograde minerals in and around the pore space, and it clogs up, and then the fluid can't get through anymore. But we know that fluids get through because rocks get retrograded. So what is happening? There's a number of things that I'll just explore kind of as thought experiments here. If you include that kind of porosity clogging in simple models of fluid flow, some interesting things happen. As many of you know, the lower part of the upper plate of an overthrust terrain like this will undergo a fairly long period of retrograde metamorphism. And when we include that porosity clogging in the simulations, the fluid flow is shunted off to the side and actually goes up and out through the foreland. So interestingly enough, if this operates, the retrograde fluids that we need to be looking for are not in the core of the orogenic belt. They're way off to the side. And in fact, these fluids would then be mixing with topographically driven fluid flow, and this would be a zone of very, very intense and high flux fluid mixing. So this is one possibility. Another are the porosity waves, at least below the brittle ductile transition. Porosity waves, by definition, have to generate porosity as they travel. So that generated porosity could open up space for retrograde reaction as the wave moved through the metacarbonate sequence, as Mung's models show. You couldn't do this forever. Ultimately, there would be some sort of strain hardening or something, and the rock would just sort of seize up. But it may be a way of producing some porosity and enhancing some of the reactivity. And of course, there's these famous examples of the fractured troctolite, illustrated here by Hatch, and Wells. Thin sections of the Stillwater complex show this very beautifully, as well as many other rocks around the world. You have a serpentinized olivine, you have the radiating cracks in the plagioclase, and as discussed in some of these recent papers, this obviously creates porosity. And the stresses, the internal stresses, can be very, very high. And it could be that some type of cracking mechanism like this creates porosity and allows retrograde reaction to occur, and it might be very, very important above the brittle ductile transition. So this is something. There's not only micro cracks, there's also macro cracks. These are cracks and veins cutting granulite facies nice. They're retrograde veins, but they contain, they're still pretty high grade. They contain garnet and kyanite. The black stuff out here, this is all biotite, all right? The rock, the host rock contains absolutely no carbon whatsoever, all right? But if you look at the veins themselves, lo and behold, you have magnesite again, magnesium carbonate, as well as carbonaceous organic matter interspersed all throughout these veins. So what these two are doing in this rock and why they're together, I have absolutely no idea. Don't know how much CO2 was transmitted through these fractures, how much got left behind as these mineral precipitates. These are all open questions about deep crustal carbon transfer that we need to work on in the future. And then maybe there's no volume change. Maybe it's a dissolution precipitation type reaction. And this has been shown experimentally and in the field too, but the experiments are extraordinary where you can see albite here in the core being replaced by K feldspar, replacement of apatite in these experiments. And this is a natural example, somewhat more complicated, of replacement along a fracture. And the idea here is that you have an original crystal, maybe cracks in it, and then there's a reaction interface that starts on the outer rim of the crystal and then moves in. It replaces the original crystal by a new reaction product, and it propagates inward because the replaced material is got a nanoporosity or a microporosity in it. And that allows reactants to diffuse in and products to diffuse out. I suppose they could flow in and out too. But anyway, they can get in and out, and that nourishes this reaction interface that moves inward into the crystal. So it's a type of pseudomorphing, if you will, and it's been studied and documented now in this series of really really extraordinary papers and related ones. All right? So if we go back to our poor tremolite, you can see that there's really been no volume change. There's no cracks. There's nothing obvious. What looks like happened is that the dolomite got in here and replaced the tremolite along cleavages and so forth, and more or less isovolumetrically, suggesting some sort of coupled dissolution precipitation. Somehow this retrograde carbonate-bearing fluid was eating its way through this rock and affecting all of this retrograde reaction. How it moved through this rock to do this, I don't know, but probably for a couple dissolution precipitation type reactions, fluid rock ratios have to be very high in order to have this happen. Okay, so where do we stand at this point? Things that I think we know are the amount of loss of CO2 that we can get from marly metacarbonate rocks. We can show that we can easily attain these kinds of fluxes on realistic orogenic timescales. But there's one thing I actually haven't told you about, and no doubt you've thought of this already, is that I didn't talk about all the CO2 that remain behind. There's about 10 to 20 weight% on average in the CO2 that stays behind in these rocks, even after they've lost their 10 weight%. So it could be that there could easily be some net removal of CO2 from the upper crustal hydrosphere atmosphere carbon cycle, at least on an orogenic time scale, because not all the CO2 is released by prograde devolatilization. That does get released, is well quantified for marls and similar rocks, but there are additional potential sources that we really need to worry about. Haven't talked about the transition from diagenesis to metamorphism in low-grade rocks, the contributions from reduced organic matter, and contributions from granulite facies and ultra-high temperature rocks. And once that CO2 is released, it has to run the gauntlet up through the crust to get out. And a big problem here is that cooling ascending fluids will tend to deposit CO2 in rocks. How much depends on the overlying rock types and their reactivity. High-grade metacarbonate rocks and ultramafic rocks will really suck up CO2 if these fluids penetrate into them. And then there are the physical mechanisms of infiltration and reaction. You know, what happens, what combination of these processes, which are more important, which ones transfer the most fluid during retrograde metamorphism? I think there's a lot we need to know before we can say anything resembling a definitive answer. So if I had to guess, if you pin me down, CO2 and the balance, I think that today, although last week when I made this slide it went the other way, but today I think that the balance is tipped towards deep carbon dioxide being sequestered on orogenic timescales relative to the amount that's actually emitted, but that's a work in progress. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge here all the students and postdocs at Yale that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. There have been many, many folks that have contributed to what you've just seen, and I'm very grateful to all of them. My faculty and research colleagues at Yale, through the years, we've talked about everything from the geophysics of porosity waves to carbon cycling to isotopic constraints on devolatilization, carbon sequestration, you name it. And I'm grateful to all of you as well, and including my colleagues in my lab and at the Peabody Museum that make a lot of this possible too. And of course, there are many, many colleagues in the petrology and geochemistry communities, way too numerous to name. I'm very gratified to see many of you in the audience now. I thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Jay, for a great lecture. We've got some time for some questions, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Julia Hammer, who's the Secretary, Volcanology, Petrology Secretary of VGP, and just mention that, of course, it's the work of the secretaries behind the scenes which produce all the great sections at AGU. So it's a nice opportunity to thank Julia and other colleagues like Matt Cohn for organising the VGP sessions at this meeting. So I'll hand over to Julia for a 5-minute question time.
Thanks. I'm sure there must be some questions following up. Yes.
That's what it is. It's graphitic organic matter. It's not very well ordered, interestingly enough, but it's graphitic organic matter. No, it's more evolved than that. It's remarkable. Oh, yeah?
Just asking, in the case where you've got dissolution in the fluid, an open system with fluid, there must presumably be constraints on the composition of the fluids and materials can be carried away.
In terms of... Yeah. So the question is the composition of the fluid and its constraints on what, porosity generation and yeah, absolutely. There are a whole host of processes that can create porosity, can create dissolution channels and so forth in rocks, and those depend on the fluid composition, the flow rate, the kinetics of the reactions, and you know, again, that's a wide open frontier to explore. Yeah. Yep, Mike. Hi. That's right. Mike Brown's comment is that the CO2 in the ultra-high temperature and granulate facies examples that I showed could in fact be residual trapping of just sort of the goo that's left over after fluid and melt extraction, and that's entirely possible. And it's interesting. It's an interesting answer one way or the other. If it does represent trapping or some kind of infiltration, the answer is important either way, because on the one hand you've got some sort of a big flux, on the other hand you don't, and we need to know the answer to move forward. Another process that I didn't mention in terms of the retrograde situation is if you evolve retrograde fluids that are very CO2 rich, they don't wet grain boundaries very well, and you can get surface tension trapping of CO2 between grain boundaries in retrograde sequences. And in fact, that's one of the mechanisms for that people appeal to in large-scale industrial carbon sequestration too. So yeah, thanks. Anything else? Oh, yeah. Yeah. The question is, does metamorphism or metamorphic outgassing, what is its impact on the burner curve? Is it there, or is it just not important, and we're just seeing other factors of the carbon cycle? Is that fair? And the answer is, great question. The answers range from carbon sequestration, which could lead to global cooling, to pulsed carbon release, which might produce bursts of CO2 and bursts of warming, to sort of not non-existent but small amounts of long-term carbon release that kind of modulate the overall curve and cause sort of the broader dips and shallows. My colleague Mark Pagani, when I asked him, if you go back, I don't think we can get there, but might be able to get back. Yeah. Anyway, if you look at the burner curve and go from, say, 600 million years to the present, there's a big, obviously, a really big issue in the Carboniferous and so forth involving plants. But overall, it's just a downward curve. It just goes down. And the question is, why is that? And I guess amongst the global change folks, I don't think I'll ever get there in time. The global change folks is that reflects the dimmer sun back in the past, and our Earth system has been changing, and the CO2 system has been changing in response to the sun brightening over the last few hundred million years. Yeah. So if you ignore the Carboniferous, which is plant-related, you can pretty much draw a straight line right from 600 million years right down to the present, which I think is really fascinating. And Bob and I and others have had endless discussions about these things at faculty meetings and whatnot. It's a great question. Okay.
Yep. So to give everyone a chance to enjoy the break and exchange fluids, we should thank Jay again for a wonderful talk. Thanks.